Hello, everyone. This is Heather Hyman with Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service, and we thank you all for joining us today for this webinar. I'm going to give a minute or two more because we have a lot of people joining right now, but then we will get started. If you are interested, if you go to the handouts section of GoToWebinar associated with this broadcast, you should be able to find a PDF of the slides that we will be presenting today, and you can feel free to download, save, and print out those for your reference. All right, since it is noon, actually, I think we will get going. Again, this is Heather Hyman, and I'm the manager of the Human Trafficking Prevention Project here at MVLS. And we are excited to welcome you today to our next webinar in our intersectionality series. This is a quarterly webinar series that the Human Trafficking Prevention Project has been hosting over the last year. This project is a partnership between Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service and the University of Baltimore School of Law. And I'm here with my co-host, Jessica Emerson, who is the director of the Human Trafficking Prevention Project and also a clinical professor at University of Baltimore. Jessica, I'll let you say hello.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us in the strangest of times.
Yes. And we are very, very excited today to be welcoming our guest presenter for this episode of the series, Lee Goodmark. So let Lee say hi really quickly.
Hi, everybody, and thanks so much to MVLS for inviting me to participate.
Before we jump in, I'd just like to give a quick introduction to Lee, or should I say Professor Goodmark? So Lee is the Marjorie Cook Professor of Law at University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law, and she co-directs the clinical law program. She teaches family law, gender in the law, gender violence in the law, and also directs the Gender Violence Clinic, which provides direct representation in matters involving intimate partner abuse, sexual assault, trafficking, and other cases involving gender violence. Professor Goodmark's scholarship has focused on intimate partner violence through pretty much throughout your whole career, I think. Lee, is that correct?
Yes, that's true.
And she has articles and publications in numerous journals, and she's authored numerous books on the subject. Prior to joining University of Maryland, she was on the faculty at University of Baltimore School of Law, where she served as the director of clinical education and co-director of the Center on Applied Feminism. And prior to that, she was the director of the Children and Domestic Violence Project at the American Bar Association Center on Children of the Law. And prior to that, she was representing battered women and children directly in the District of Columbia in custody, visitation, child support, restraining order, and other civil matters. Lee is a graduate of Yale University and Stanford Law School, and I cannot imagine anyone better to be joining us today as we dive into this issue. So just to get started, you can see we have a short agenda. We only have an hour, but we'll be diving deeper into the intersection of domestic violence and human trafficking. We'll be looking at how these two issues overlap, what survivors' experiences are, the distinctions between survivors' experiences. Then we'll be looking at recommendations for assisting human trafficking survivors that are grappling with family law matters, and give some best practice suggestions. And we'll also have a case scenario for discussion at the end. I would like to note that while everyone will be muted throughout the webinar, there is a chat option available. It's at the bottom of your dashboard, and I will be keeping an eye on the chat. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in, and we will take pauses throughout the presentation to answer any questions you might have. With that, I think we'll dive into our first section and look at some definitions to get started.
Great. Thank you, Heather. And again, thank you for joining us, and thanks to Lee for agreeing to lead this discussion for us. So we're going to talk some definitions of domestic violence and human trafficking. There's a definition of domestic violence from the National Network to End Domestic Violence. And as the definition suggests, domestic violence is a pattern of coercive, controlling behavior that can include varying forms of abuse. We can see emotional, psychological abuse, reproductive abuse, financial abuse. So some abusers are able to exert complete control over a victim's every actions without ever using violence, or only by using subtle threats of violence, or by financial control, or control over someone's reproductive system. All types of domestic violence can obviously be devastating to victims. And it's, I'm sure it's obvious to pretty much everyone that domestic violence is a pervasive, life-threatening crime that affects millions of individuals across the United States. And this is regardless of age, of economic status, race, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, ability, or education level. Human trafficking, primarily, the first thing you need to know is that it's a crime, and it is a human rights violation that is defined as such in international law, on the federal level, on the state level, and in some places on the local level. At this point, every single state in the country has laws on the books against domestic violence, and that movement really began building around 2006, 2007, and I think the process was complete for all 50 states to have these laws on the books around 2015. But the easiest way, since there are, varying definitions throughout the country, is to look at the federal definition, which is from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was first passed in the year 2000, subsequently reauthorized most recently in 2019. And the way that the TVPA defines human trafficking is that they bifurcate it into both sex and labor trafficking. So I'm just going to talk briefly about both of those definitions. So sex trafficking, as you can see, is defined as a commercial sex act, an act induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or where the person induced to perform such an act is under the age of 18. And that or where the person induced is really important in understanding the definition of sex trafficking, because federal law and most state laws define any minor who is engaging in a commercial sex act, that is trading sex for money or something of value, which could be drugs, which could be housing. If that individual is 17 years old or younger, they are defined under federal and certain state laws as victims of sex trafficking per se. When you're talking about adults, so 18 years or older, there has to be force, fraud, or coercion. I'm going to go into the definition of labor trafficking first before I just give a couple of brief examples of force, fraud, or coercion. So labor trafficking, it is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, etc., of a person for labor or services through force, fraud, or coercion. Those three terms are really important. For involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. Congress was not they expanded, let's just say that. So it's really important to understand that victims can be trafficked along non-trafficked workers in legal jobs, be forced to work under the table or for no pay in legal businesses or in the informal economy, or be forced to commit criminal acts that benefit someone else, like dealing drugs or trafficking drugs. They may be trapped by violence, by threats of deportation, threats against family members. Labor traffickers most commonly target, I say this loosely, but they do most commonly target immigrants, both with those with legal status and those without, but they also prey on vulnerable US citizens. And so in both of these definitions, I've talked about force, fraud, or coercion. So it's worth noting just a couple of examples of those. So we have a kind of working definition. Force is pretty easy to understand: sexual violence, physical violence, restraining someone, isolating someone. But unfortunately, for those of you who have heard me talk about this, in terms of what the media portrays, which is where the majority of people get their information on what human trafficking is, they kind of stop there. And you see people rescued out of basements, chained to radiators and things like that. But what we really much more commonly see is fraud or coercion. And fraud is just the classic bait and switch, where one thing is offered and another is delivered, or one thing is offered and the promised thing is delivered but switched at some point. So I will offer you protection while you engage in commercial sex acts, and we'll split the money, becomes you give me all your money or I'll harm you in the process. Or a promised job in nursing becomes something else. And so it's just classically the bait and switch. And the fraud can really be as simple as just a when she is when you're talking about just a promise of leaving a better life, essentially. And with regard to coercion, that's pretty much the easiest way to control somebody, because all that really matters is that you find out what somebody needs, and you either fulfill that need or you temporarily fulfill that need. And that can be the need for housing, for drugs, or simply because someone is struggling with low self-esteem. So there are a lot of different ways to control folks. And quite honestly, we'll go over this in a couple of slides. You see a lot of similar kind of bait and switches, coercion and force in interpersonal violence as well.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And one thing I just wanted to note, it may seem sort of basic, starting with these definitions, and we'll be turning next to looking at some other, ways to categorize and break down some of the abuse, violence, coercion that people face that are in either domestic violence and or trafficking situations. But for a lot of the people that might be tuning in today, they might not be as familiar with these issues. We have a wide range of audience members, people working in government, people that are advocates, people who might be attorneys that have rarely worked with survivors. So we wanted to start from a place where we could all be on the same page around these conversations.
So what you're seeing now is what's called the power and control wheel. The power and control wheel is a kind of a graphic representation of the various ways that someone who is using violence can exert power and control over a partner. And it was first developed by the Duluth Abuse Intervention Project quite some time ago. It's used really all over the world now. And I think it's helpful in giving you a sense of the range of different kinds of behaviors that might be involved in an abusive relationship. So you see the spokes on the wheel include things like using coercion and threats, using intimidation, using emotional abuse, using isolation, controlling what someone does or who they see, using children, making somebody feel guilty about the impact on their children, actually abusing children when they don't have access to the primary victim, minimizing, denying, and blaming behavior. There are things that aren't included on the power and control wheel. So economic abuse is there, but there are other forms of abuse that one might look for as well, including reproductive abuse, actively trying to get someone pregnant to control them, interfering with their use of birth control, spiritual abuse, interfering with someone's spiritual life in order to control their behavior. And on the wheel, of course, is using male privilege. I think the wheel can be misleading in that what it looks like here is that you have all these lesser behaviors that are joined by this broader band of physical or sexual violence. In fact, all of these things coexist, and the amount of physical violence that someone uses may actually be minimal. If someone has achieved coercive control over a partner, it's the ability to use violence that can keep that partner from being able to act rather than the actual use of violence. So when I think about this graphic, I actually think of physical and sexual violence as just another spoke on the wheel and not the thing that holds all of the rest of these behaviors together necessarily. The reason I think that's important for you to understand is that sometimes when we see a relationship where there's minimal, if any, physical violence, but significant emotional abuse, we may think, well, there really isn't domestic violence here. And in fact, the clients that I've worked with over the past 25 years have consistently told me that it's the emotional abuse, it's the psychological abuse that it actually has the greatest impact on them, much more so than the physical violence that they've experienced. That's not to say that there isn't kind of extreme physical violence in some of these cases. It is to say that if there isn't that kind of extreme physical violence, it doesn't mean that there's no domestic violence or intimate partner violence happening.
Thank you, Lee. We'll move on to the next slide, which is a little different context with a visual graphic that references human trafficking. And it's interesting to compare these two graphics as we look at these intersecting forms of violence.
Yeah, so much of what you see on the human trafficking power and control wheel is very, very similar to the intimate partner violence or domestic violence power and control wheel. Coercion and threats, intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, delay, denying, blaming, and minimizing. You see sexual abuse as a kind of a spoke as opposed to the wheel. I don't think that matters all that much, and physical abuse the same. And I think what's interesting is that you see using privilege in the trafficking power and control wheel that really could belong just as easily in the intimate partner violence control wheel as well. And again, you see economic abuse here, with labor trafficking and sex trafficking being that external thing that's holding all of it together. But again, these are useful representations to give you a sense of the range of the kinds of behaviors that might be involved in these trafficking and intimate partner violence relationships, and to show you just how much overlap there is between the two areas. We often, those of us who work in these areas, often feel siloed in that people who do intimate partner violence work talk to other people who do intimate partner violence work, and people who do trafficking work talk to other people who do trafficking work, when in fact there's a tremendous amount of overlap among these areas, and you may see multiple kinds of behaviors within the same relationship.
I agree, and I think that some of the examples that are given within this wheel in particular, they can serve as some flags that practitioners and advocates and attorneys can just be aware of as they're talking to potential clients or to individuals that are seeking services, that might kind of raise that awareness that there could be more at play than a domestic violence situation. There might also be some trafficking involved as well.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting with the first DV wheel, it's really gendered, talks about women being harmed and men being the harmers. And obviously we know that both in human trafficking and in domestic violence, it is exclusive of sex assigned at birth, gender identity, sexual orientation, but that those things in themselves can become risk factors because of the way that folks are isolated and denied opportunities due to their sexual orientation, gender identity, and things of that nature.
Yes. So Jess, I'll hand it off to you to talk about some of the similarities in survivors' experiences.
Sure. I think Lee laid it out perfectly in kind of comparing and contrasting those two wheels. With their limitations, they do highlight that both people who are experiencing intimate partner violence and human trafficking may experience a wide range of abuses, from the physical violence to those more subtle forms of coercion. And Lee, I love the way that you highlighted something that we see in the trafficking world that actually interferes in the prosecution of traffickers, which is that in a lot of cases when there are more subtle forms of coercion, or like you said, when a trafficker or an intimate partner kind of gains control through coercion and the threat of physical violence and things like that, and sexual violence are always there, that can almost be the quote unquote most effective or most powerful way to control someone. And when you're talking about issues of prosecuting traffickers or potentially getting a protective order for someone in a violent relationship, when we've kind of been socialized to think that there has to be that exceptional amount of physical violence. And you're right, in some cases there definitely are. But as advocates for this population, it's important to understand those more subtle forms of coercion and how powerful they can be. Another similarity between these two types of survivors is that they may be reluctant to report or to access help from law enforcement service providers or the courts. Now that may be because they are worried that they're not going to be believed, but more concretely, when you're talking about issues of human trafficking and domestic violence, they may face arrest or deportation just for reporting. If I am working without documentation and I'm trying to report labor trafficking, I'm risking being deported. If I am engaging in commercial sex acts, I'm risking being arrested because of prostitution. And depending on, Lee obviously is the expert in this, but in different states, there are mandatory arrest policies. If you reported some form of domestic violence, you could both be arrested. What's another similarity is that a lot of survivors of both these crimes may not perceive their abuser or their trafficker as a perpetrator. And unfortunately, that tends to sometimes be compounded by certain service providers who kind of all or nothing, the people in these perpetrators in these people's lives, like they are only perpetrators, they are only violent, they are only dangerous, when we all know that relationships between human beings are a lot more complex than that. And so when somebody is in love with someone who's harming them, when someone is in a relationship with someone who provides needed care and concern for themselves or for their children, these relationships are complicated. So seeking help or kind of learning more about the dynamics of the violence or coercion that they're experiencing can be difficult. In court, in particular, in court cases, both criminal and civil cases, which we'll talk a lot more about going forward. So I'm not going to say too much about this. These two particular survivors may face credibility issues. So if I'm working without documentation, or if I'm engaging in commercial sex acts, I may be deemed less than credible to the people I report to or to the court systems where I report that abuse. And similar to the old adage of why didn't she just leave in domestic violence situations, we hear that same type of victim blaming applied to human trafficking survivors as well. The kind of more positive similarity is that these two types of crimes, or victims of both of these crimes, may be eligible for help from a range of different legal systems, from the civil legal system, the criminal legal system. They may be eligible for immigration remedies. And so when Lee talked about us feeling siloed, it is really important to kind of think about, we might be all working with the same type of client, because we don't want to pigeonhole that this person is only eligible for this type of relief going forward, when the reality is there may be help from several different legal systems.
Thank you, Jess. And this slide just continues that discussion. You know, the title of the slide really says it all, that when you're looking at these two categories of dynamics and of abuse, that the complexity of these dynamics really do defy easy categorization. And I think this first bullet point, that traffickers might be the victim's spouse or intimate partner, and that makes it very difficult to discern between the two forms of violence, was really covered well by Jess during her discussion of the last slide. You know, if somebody is providing all kinds of levels of perhaps financial, emotional, you know, different types of support and sustenance to a survivor, it can be very hard to kind of pick things apart. And so it's better to look holistically at the survivor's circumstances, and I think look kind of with a remedies-based approach of what may be available to somebody, instead of trying to put them into one category or another category. I think it's also really important, especially if you don't have much experience working with survivors of intimate partner violence or of trafficking, to just be aware of the second bullet point, that traffickers are often seeking out potential victims who do have histories of domestic violence or sexual abuse. We see situations very often where traffickers begin to groom people, starting often when they're minors, and they look for people who have survived neglect, child sexual abuse, and other things that make them already more vulnerable. And they find out those vulnerabilities, and then they try to meet that person's needs. What can they provide to become that person's support, someone that person relies on, trusts, and then it can turn later down the road into an exploitative situation. This also ties in with that third bullet point that notes that a history of trafficking might make a survivor more vulnerable to future domestic violence and vice versa. Again, if somebody has already experienced trauma, has already been exploited, has already been abused, been subject to coercion, emotional, psychological harm, and violence, it can really make somebody more vulnerable to that in the future. And I've personally seen so many cases where someone is in an abusive relationship later in their life, and the abuser is holding the survivor's past experiences, especially if they've been forced to engage in commercial sex, over their head as something that they're going to share with the world or out about them, that would have huge implications for the survivor, and that really is a leverage of control over the survivor's behavior and makes them stay in an abusive relationship. And then the fourth point, again, if you just identify a client that you're working with as either a survivor of human trafficking or of domestic violence, it can really limit services and remedies. I mean, one example that just pops to mind is if somebody has been forced to trade commercial sex or to, work in a forced labor situation, they might be entitled to restitution or to other monetary compensation. And so if we don't view them through the lens of being a trafficking survivor and don't look into whether they meet that definition, and we think because the person who was trafficking them was an intimate partner, was a spouse, we might not be looking at the range of remedies that are available to people.
And Heather, I like in kind of summing up that slide, the word that comes to mind is a cycle, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the child sexual abuse makes you vulnerable to the trafficking, which makes you vulnerable to the domestic violence, which makes you vulnerable to the criminalization, which makes you, you know what I mean? And so those power and control wheels are also really useful to kind of just encapsulate everything in a circle so that sometimes it feels like there's no way out.
You can almost think of them as two interlocking gears, that people are going to be, impacted by all of these different things in different ways throughout different periods in their life, and experiencing one can lead to them experiencing the other. We should invent a new graphic.
Yeah, let's get on that since we are all quarantined at home. All right, so we've talked about kind of the silos that develop. We've talked about the overlap. We've talked about how the siloing can really impact survivors of both crimes negatively. Let's talk, this slide is fairly self-explanatory, but the reasons why it's important to screen for human trafficking in domestic violence cases is that survivors of both human trafficking and domestic violence are indeed more likely to identify first or be screened first as a survivor of domestic violence. And that, it's really that human trafficking or domestic violence has 20, 30 years on the human trafficking field. And so there's a greater number of agencies, practices, awareness about individuals fleeing interpersonal violence. And so the odds are that these individuals are going to come into contact with an agency that or service provider that focuses on intimate partner violence. And again, just kind of that lag in awareness means that survivors may not be aware that their experiences meet the definition of legal or, of sex or labor trafficking, and that they can access additional protections and remedies, as we've been talking. I mean, I remember one of the first survivors that I worked with as an attorney when we were talking about this very violent interpersonal relationship that did indeed lead to trafficking, into her being forced into trading commercial sex. I remember she said to me, "Oh, I just thought that's how dating was." So it's really kind of helping folks, not necessarily telling people that they are a victim or that they have to identify as such, but just that the experiences that they're describing also meet the legal definition of human trafficking, and as a result, there may be additional protections and remedies available to them.
Yeah, Jess, I think that's so important to let the naming be done by the survivor. It's one of the most critical things as we advocate for survivors of trafficking, is to let them know that, they don't have to identify as such, but there is this legal definition that they can meet that can open up a lot of different potential helps for them that they can access. So,
and that's really about kind of reversing or addressing the trauma that comes from an experience where someone feels like they have a lack of control. The thing that a service provider doesn't want to do is then tell somebody what they are and who they are and what their experiences are. And that kind of goes back to the point that I was making about the perpetrators of both of these crimes being loved ones or family members or things like that. And if we as service providers take that next step to demonize that individual or to tell somebody what their experiences are, we are taking control away from a person who's already had enough control taken away from them.
Exactly. Thank you.
So as we think about screening for trafficking and domestic violence cases, here are some things that you might be looking for. You might be looking for someone who describes being trafficked to her partner's friends or his partner's friends by the person who's using violence. And when we say being trafficked here, we don't necessarily mean commercial sex or for money, but someone who is telling their partner, you need to have sex with these other people for whatever reason. So looking for a financial gain isn't necessarily the issue. Looking for somebody who is being used to have sex with others is what you're looking for. But of course, it could be for commercial gain. And so having somebody engage in sex work once in a while at, we say, their request, it may be the demand or it may be the threat of the person who's been using violence as well. Looking for someone who has arrests or convictions for prostitution or other kinds of offenses that we might expect to see in the context of human trafficking, loitering, for example, being one of them. And finally, we can't forget about labor trafficking, because labor trafficking is obviously happening in the context of intimate partner relationships and other kinds of family relationships as well. So someone who is being made to work at their abuser or their relative's home or family business and is not being paid or cannot access their wages, or who is just being held. They may be getting wages, but maybe being held, which was the case in one of our cases. So those are the kinds of things that you want to look at as you're screening for trafficking in these cases.
Thank you. And I'll just remind everyone that if you have questions as we close out this first section, we'd be happy to answer any of those. You can also feel free, if there's any follow-up later as you're thinking about our discussion today, you can feel free to email any questions to us after the webinar. So now we'll turn to the second portion of the webinar, looking at how we can assist human trafficking survivors with family law matters. And we'll get started here by just talking about some of the legal challenges that we might all be facing when representing human trafficking survivors and some of the things that survivors themselves might be confronting.
Great. One of the most concrete challenges that we face in representing survivors of trafficking in any case involving their trafficking is the lack of judicial training in criminal courts, but specific to this topic in family law courts on human trafficking issues. Now, I will say that that's something that I've seen the judiciary, for some reason I can never say that word, judiciary, take a more aggressive stance on in the past couple of years. But again, being 20, 30 years behind the intimate partner violence movement, the lack of judicial training is one of the most concrete problems that we face. I also can never overstate the impact that trauma can have on a survivor's willingness, ability to get involved in a legal process where their trafficking is an issue or where they will be facing their abuser in court. We did a webinar, oh boy, maybe a year ago at this point, that focused exclusively on trauma. And so if you're interested in learning more about that topic in particular, I encourage you to go to MVLS's website under the attorney resources and look at the trauma training. But just generally speaking, trauma in the courtroom might look like, you know, a return of or an increase in active mental health symptoms, a flat affect or a labile affect, which is an affect that goes up and down. You might be looking at someone who's highly emotional, who's hostile, who's angry, who is avoidant of appointments with you, avoidant of court dates, forgetful. And those kind of things, especially someone's affect, you know, if they are talking, for instance, about something incredibly traumatic, and the way that I always explain it is that they're talking about it like they're asking, like you had just asked them what kind of toppings they want on their pizza. That can really affect somebody's credibility and believability. And so as advocates, we have to function as interpreters to what trauma actually looks like. Trauma, when someone is incredibly emotional and crying and scared, that tends to be believable. But in, you know, my 20 years of working with survivors of trafficking, I much more often see folks who have very little affect, who are very flat in their description of things, who are very forgetful of important details. And those things impact someone's credibility. So as an advocate, you need to be aware of those things when you are working with survivors in the courtroom. And also just because of the, you know, the lag time, there are fewer state laws, and there are state laws that are changing a lot in terms of protecting trafficking survivors. For instance, in Maryland, we only got a labor trafficking law on the books as of October 1st of last year. So we're talking about cases, I can't even imagine the number of cases that weren't prosecuted because the way that labor trafficking was or the way that folks were trying to code certain aspects of labor trafficking weren't necessarily assumed to be suitable for these prosecutions. Now, there are also good things that are happening, especially in the state of Maryland, in terms of protections for trafficking survivors. Pending the governor's signature, we will actually have a change to what's called a vacatur law, which is a law or a criminal record relief law, speaking more generally, which is a law in the state of Maryland that at present allows a survivor of sex trafficking to vacate or set aside a prostitution conviction that they got while they were being trafficked. And if the governor signs this bill, or even if he doesn't, given the current circumstances, this law is going to open up and allow folks who have been trafficked for sex or for other forms of labor to vacate a whole host of other convictions. And so it's, again, there are fewer state laws protecting trafficking survivors. They're rapidly changing, and there are great examples of that in Maryland. And those are some of the legal challenges that you have to be aware of when you are representing human trafficking survivors in the courtroom setting.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And just continuing this discussion of what those legal challenges are, I think it's important to note that trafficking survivors might have some different safety concerns than domestic violence survivors. And this ties into the second point on this slide as well, that there is, when you're asking trafficking survivors to engage in any court process, there is this risk that they're going to be having prolonged contact with the trafficker throughout that time and through potentially a number of different legal venues. And that can be very re-traumatizing. And for some survivors, it may be something that they want. They may want to see justice happen in through one legal remedy or another, but others may not want to have that prolonged contact, and they might actually be, at risk. As we've discussed already, there is just in general less institutional support for trafficking survivors than domestic violence survivors, and not quite as deep of an understanding of the dynamics of the issues that each type of survivor faces, and especially if people are facing kind of overlapping issues. And, there might be other considerations that the trafficking survivor is grappling with. If the trafficker has a wider network that might be putting the survivor's safety at risk, if they're a member of a gang, if there's any other associations that could, potentially lead to harm in the future, that might be something they're considering. A survivor might also be grappling with having, active criminal cases against them that are pending, or records that they're concerned about that might impact kind of their desire to go forward with different types of legal proceedings. And that speaks to, again, this third point on the slide, that there can really be sometimes unexpected outcomes and interactions if a survivor is pursuing remedies or involved with proceedings across different legal systems. I heard recently at a training from the Coalition Against Slavery and Trafficking, also known as CAST, they had a great recommendation, and it was really to kind of use a balance test when you're working with trafficking survivors. Work with the survivor to identify their ultimate legal goal, explain the processes that are involved in meeting that goal, and then really balance that against the risk of re-traumatization, against looking at the likelihood of success, looking at their safety concerns, and looking at the impact of other legal proceedings that they might be involved in. I thought that was a really good recommendation.
Heather, I think you said something so crucial that seems to be kind of another theme throughout, is that let survivors define what justice looks like for them.
Exactly.
Because for every survivor, it may not be having their trafficker behind bars. And as a society, we've decided that that's what justice is when it comes to trafficking. And that's not necessarily the case. And again, that's taking another choice away from a survivor.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And we've seen cases, I think all three presenters have seen many examples of this in the work they've done. Recently I've seen situations where people have been hesitant to, even file for custody of a child because they don't know what the implications are going to be as the custody proceedings go on. And they're, they have to talk about their experience as a trafficking survivor. I've seen cases where individuals have been hesitant to file for vacatur because they didn't know what was going to happen under the current Maryland law, where the state's attorney's office would have to be made aware of their trafficking experience in order for them to actually file that petition to vacate prostitution convictions. So this can play out in a lot of different ways. And with that, we'll turn it back over to Lee to talk about some specific remedies and share her expertise.
Thanks, Heather. So first we want to talk about protective orders and peace orders. Peace and protective orders are remedies in Maryland and actually throughout the United States that are designed to create separation between people who've been subjected to abuse and their partners, prevent further abuse, and provide some kind of basic remedies that may be essential in the context of intimate partner violence. So in Maryland, we've split that work up between what are called protective orders and peace orders. And the difference between protective and peace orders has to do with both the relationships involved and the remedies that are available. So a protective order is available to what's called a person eligible for relief, PEFR, or we call them PEFRs. And a person eligible for relief in a protective order context includes somebody who's related by blood, marriage, or adoption, someone who is married to another person, somebody who shares custody with the other person, or shares actually not physical custody, not necessarily legal custody. Somebody who has been in an intimate relationship with another person, has cohabited with another person, or as recently clarified by the General Assembly, was raped by another person. And those relationships make you eligible for a protective order. Peace orders are for people who don't have the specific relationships that are laid out in the protective order statute. So that's how you know which one you're eligible for. And in the context of a protective order, what you can get is an order that starts out by lasting up to a year and can be extended beyond that original year, that tells the person who has used violence against you that they cannot continue to assault, threaten, harass, or physically abuse you, that they cannot come near you, that they can't come to your home, to your place of work, to your school, or to your child's school, that makes arrangements for custody of children, and that makes arrangements for some kinds of economic resources. And so the peace order, by contrast, only lasts for up to 6 months, and you have to show not only that some form of abuse has happened, but that it's likely to happen again in the future. The kinds of abuse that a protective order contemplates include serious bodily harm, fear of imminent serious bodily harm, which is basically a threat, but it has to be a threat with some good faith reason to believe that the person will carry through on that threat, assault in any degree, rape or sexual assault, stalking, and some forms of electronic cyber harassment. And so that's basically the protective order statute. Peace order grounds are actually a little bit broader and include trespass and destruction of property and harassment, as well as the things that I've already talked about. So the benefits of obtaining a peace or a protective order are pretty clear. They can create separation in the moment. There's a legal authority that says you can't be around or near this other person, you can't intrude on their home or their place of work, you can't contact them. And for some people, if separation is what they need, having the authority of a court order to say that that separation exists is important. A second thing that it does is it creates an enhanced response by police. So while a protective or a peace order is a civil proceeding, the violation of a protective or a police order is a criminal offense. If you call the police to say that your peace or protective order has been violated, in theory, there should be an enhanced response by the police, and that violation is considered a misdemeanor offense. A protective or peace order can give you temporary custody of children, as I mentioned, and a variety of economic resources, including what's called emergency family maintenance, which is similar to child support, but is available both to spouses and to those who share children in common. It can give you the use and possession of family goods, including a family car. A protective order can also give you use and possession of a family home, so that gives the person who is experiencing harm a place to stay while everything else in that family's life may be pending. Some of the barriers to obtaining a protective or peace order include the fear of engaging with the courts. As both Jess and Heather have already mentioned, survivors of both intimate partner violence and trafficking may be reluctant to come into contact with the courts, both because of bad past experiences, either in the civil or in the criminal system, or because of concerns about credibility, or because of concerns about what that process, that adversarial process, may look or feel like. Some people have described the adversarial process as a great way to re-traumatize victims, and knowing that you may have to face the person who's hurt you, or that you might be cross-examined by the person who's hurt you, may keep you from being willing to come forward. There may also be an increased risk to survivors as a result of taking legal action. When you take legal action, you are sending a signal to the person who's harming you that says, I am taking control of my life. And at the time of separation, there can be a great deal of violence. It can increase the risk of violence, and taking court action is a way of saying, I want that separation. So in fact, there may be an increased risk of harm that comes from letting the person who's harming you know that you are taking legal action. It can also increase the risk to survivors' loved ones when the person is no longer able to get to you directly. They may try to go at you through a third party. And even though protective and peace orders forbid contact through a third party, it doesn't forbid, for example, the harassment of a third party to say, where is this person? Why can't I talk to this person? Which is a little bit different. There may also be interaction with other criminal cases that are pending. So for example, in Maryland, as you may know, the commissioner system allows anybody to file charges against anybody just by making those allegations. It may be that once you file your protective order, your partner may seek to get some leverage by filing a criminal case against you. It may also be that you have a pending criminal case for the same behavior that leads to the issuance of the protective order. In either one of those cases, anything that is said in the context of the protective order can be used in the criminal case to establish that you have testified inconsistently with what you said in the protective order proceeding. So that may have bearing, for example, if you are the subject of a criminal case, you may not want to testify for risk of having that used to incriminate you later. It may also be that that testimony is used in other kinds of contexts, including the vacatur remedy that Jess was just talking about, where you may see state's attorneys and others go to get that information to use it in the context of that vacatur. So it's important to know that the things that you say in the context of a protective order or peace order proceeding can be used against you in other cases. For those who are interested in resources around protective and peace orders, we actually have a fairly rich system of representation, although by no means adequate to meet the need, in Maryland. Both the House of Ruth and the Women's Law Center run protective order advocacy and representation projects in the courts in Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and Montgomery County. Other organizations, including, for example, the YWCA in Anne Arundel, Hartley House in, I just forgot the name of the county, and Hope. Thank you. And HopeWorks in Howard County have attorneys who are available to do that kind of representation. So if you have a victim of trafficking who's also interested in getting a protective order, it might be worth pointing them in that direction. One last thing to point out, just again, to make sure that I'm clear about it, folks who have been raped are eligible for protective orders. You're eligible for that order against the person who raped you. So it may be that someone who's been trafficked also has been raped either by their trafficker or by someone else. Protective order may be available to you in that situation.
Thank you.
Going on.
Can I just clarify for 1 second too, for MVLS attorneys, this is not something that Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service generally does, is providing clients with representation in protection order cases, but we are happy to connect any clients that you might have or individuals that are reaching out for help for other legal matters to any of the resources that Lee just mentioned.
Thanks, Heather. So going to our next slide around custody cases involving trafficking survivors. The standard of proof in a custody case is always the best interest of the child. And so when you're doing a custody case involving a trafficking survivor, you have to be thinking about how you're going to argue that best interest standard. And those considerations are different, of course, if the child's father is the trafficker or if the child's father is not the trafficker. But either way, best interests are what you're thinking about. If the child's father is the trafficker, thinking about joint custody is going to be important. Although we don't have a presumption for joint custody in the Maryland courts, either for joint physical or joint legal custody, and just to be very clear for those of you who are not family law lawyers, physical custody simply means who has the child on a day-to-day basis. Legal custody means who has the authority to make legal decisions for the child in some of the major decision-making areas, including religion, discipline, medical care, and education. So even though we don't have a joint custody presumption, many courts start from the idea that children are best served when both parents are involved in their lives. Joint custody requires a tremendous amount of communication between parents. And so if the other parent is your trafficker, that may be dangerous to you. That's a place where you really want to think about giving information about that past relationship. The other thing about best interests is that, to be quite blunt, the experience of having done commercial sex work is something that will always be used against a victim of trafficking in a custody case. In addition to that, arrests and convictions for prostitution and other forms of crime are going to be used to undermine both their credibility and their parenting ability. So you have to expect that that information is going to come in. And whereas criminal convictions and criminal activity are somewhat restricted in terms of their relevance in other kinds of proceedings, in custody cases where you're assessing the best interests of the child, they're going to be fair game. So you need to understand that that information is going to come out. You need to think about what you're going to do with it. We don't in Maryland actually have a presumption against awarding custody to an abusive parent. What we do have is a statute that says if you have reason to believe that the other party, if the court has reason to believe that the other party has committed abuse against a parent or their spouse or a child in the household, the court has to make arrangements for custody and visitation that protect the child and the victim. So this presumption is, or this constraint is not as strong as the presumptions that other states have. Many states do have presumptions against awarding custody or visitation to an abusive parent. We don't have that. And you may have to remind the court that that statute exists. Not every court is familiar with the existence of that statute that requires them to find that the visitation and custody provisions that they're ordering will be safe for the child, the child's parent, and for the siblings. In terms of evidentiary issues that you might see, you may want to think about how you bring in evidence of trafficking. That may be very difficult, as is evidence of intimate partner violence. Traditionally, we've always seen difficulty around having courts believe the stories of both victims of trafficking and victims of intimate partner violence. Jess mentioned that there hasn't been much training for judges around trafficking. I would add that although there has been training for judges around intimate partner violence, we still face tremendous amounts of resistance to the idea that intimate partner violence has some bearing on somebody's capacity to parent. And we often see judges questioning the evidence that we do offer. Remember too that testimony is evidence. And so having somebody tell their story in a credible way is absolutely going to be relevant. You may have complications in obtaining child support because you often will have lack of reported income. Income in trafficking is obviously something that's not being reported to the IRS. And so getting somebody's tax forms to be able to establish the appropriate amount of child support may be difficult. I want to note too that we have a statute that allows for the termination of parental rights for those who conceive a child as a result of rape. And so you want to think about that as well. But I want to step back for a minute and just say there are all kinds of questions about whether you would bring a custody case in the first instance when you have someone who has experienced intimate partner violence and trafficking. And particularly if the father of the child is not necessarily the trafficker, you'll have things that you want to think about. Do you want to expose all of this history to the courts? Do you want to bring a legal claim knowing that you could expose yourself to this kind of really severe questioning? Know that a parent who is a trafficker will use every opportunity to try to hold that victim responsible for all of the behavior while disclaiming any responsibility of their own, so that if the victim, for example, has been arrested for prostitution or convicted of prostitution, but the trafficker has never been convicted of anything, you need to anticipate that narrative. I want to touch very briefly, because our time is growing short, on considerations in divorce cases involving trafficking survivors. Just to say that in Maryland, we have no fault grounds for divorce. Those grounds allow you to get a divorce if you have lived separate and apart without cohabitation for a period of 12 months. For most people, those grounds are what they choose to use because there's a far lower degree of kind of dissent around those grounds. Most people can agree that they've lived separate and apart for a year. You're not fighting about whose fault the end of the relationship was. But it is possible in cases involving trafficking survivors, as in the cases of intimate partner violence survivors, that you might want to use cruelty or excessively vicious conduct grounds. Those are fault-based grounds. They don't require you to have been living separate and apart for any particular period of time. So you can get around that 12 months of separation if you want to file more quickly by alleging cruelty or excessively vicious conduct. And it may be important to your client to have the court validate their claims of cruelty and excessively vicious conduct within the relationship. Sometimes we could go forward on no fault grounds. We choose to go forward on the fault-based grounds because it's important to the client that we tell that story. In terms of property division and alimony, both property division and alimony allow for the consideration of fault in the relationship using a standard called the circumstances contributing to the estrangement of the parties. And so if you can argue that the reason that these parties have divided is because of one party's abusive behavior, whether that's trafficking or intimate partner violence against the other, you may be able to argue that your party should be entitled to a greater share of the marital property or entitled to some alimony. I would note that we have what's called equitable property distribution in Maryland. That doesn't mean equal, that means fair. And so you can argue that it would be more fair to give a greater share of the property to the person who has been abused. I would also note that although alimony still exists on the books, grants of alimony are very, very rare and generally restricted to long-term marriages where one party has very little ability to re-enter the workforce.
Thank you so much, Leah. That was so informative to just be able to walk through some of these considerations in these different types of cases. We do have a few questions I'd like to turn to before we jump into the case scenario in our remaining few minutes. So we had one question about asking about police officers and detectives who might give victims of trafficking an ultimatum, either to go to jail for prostitution or to go to a shelter. Specifically when the victim doesn't see themselves as a victim of trafficking. The questioner was asking, should there be additional training for officers? Is this something that either of you have seen in your practice and in working with survivors?
This is Jessica. Short answer is yes. I've seen service providers of all different types make decisions for survivors that they may not be ready for, may be, need more time to process. I think anytime that, law enforcement is working within societal issues, there has to be additional training on some of the repercussions and the trauma that can actually result with an intersection within a system that's supposed to be able to help them. I know that there have been, again, an increase in training, absolutely. But, we're talking about a system that is deeply entrenched, and that is not going to readily change very quickly. But yes, I think we need to be talking to our law enforcement partners about the trauma that can be caused by forcing an ultimatum on a survivor of intimate partner violence or trafficking.
Thank you, Jess. Lee, did you have any additions to that at all?
No, I don't. I thought Jess covered it beautifully.
And then one other question that was actually about vacature. A questioner was wondering if a survivor who did not want to support prosecution of a trafficker, whether that undermines their eligibility for relief under the vacature law. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
The answer is it depends. I think that one of the things that our program has done a great job of is in really working collaboratively with prosecutors and saying that, this process is restorative, this process is ameliorative, and to then kind of force a decision on someone or say that you're not allowed to pursue this relief unless and until you agree to provide testimony in a criminal case. Unfortunately, the reality is the way that the law is written now, that could happen because at this point, until this bill passes and goes into effect, before an attorney can file a petition for vacature with the court, they have to get the consent of the state's attorney in the jurisdiction that prosecuted the survivor. And so, yeah, it kind of unfortunately functions in the way that T visas do, or that in the way that T visas can, where, if I am the officer who's saying, have you made reasonable or have you complied with reasonable requests to participate in a law enforcement investigation? I'm the one who decides what reasonable is. And if my goal is more to prosecute a trafficker than it is to offer this relief to you, then I may make the decision that, yeah, I'm going to hold that over you. The change I have not seen that, I will tell you, because I think we've done a really great job in partnering with the prosecutors' offices, and I think that they get this and they get the work that we do. But that is going to change in terms of the vacature context, because that restriction will be lifted, and that if there is some sort of disagreement and lack of consent on the part of the prosecutors, then there'll be a hearing, like in every other legal context. So I think that could definitely be a problem. It hasn't been, but that will change with this new law.
Thank you so much, Jess. And I realize that we have now hit 1 o'clock, and I think we'll just go 5 minutes over quickly to run through our case scenario and then provide a few more updates. But thank you again to so many of us that have joined, so many of you that have joined us and that continue to stay with us as we kind of wrap up this discussion around this important topic. So I'm just going to quickly run through the case scenario and ask Lee for some thoughts about what's presented here. So this case scenario is basically about an individual, D, who started dating someone when she was 18, and the person she was dating, Keith, was 25. After a few months, the relationship became controlling and abusive, and Keith started telling D she was worthless. She could never support herself on her own. He began hitting and choking her during fights. Dee, who was a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, became depressed and isolated from her friends and family. Dee and Keith both used heroin and pills, and Dee coped with the increasing violence and abuse through more frequent drug use. After Keith lost his job, he pressured Dee to make money to support their basic needs and drug use by trading sex. He put up a profile of her on Craigslist and arranged for her to go on dates with men who contacted them online. If Keith felt that Dee did not make enough money from the dates he arranged, he would become violent. After 2 years of being with Keith, Dee became pregnant. During the pregnancy, Keith was not as violent and no longer forced Dee to trade sex, but continued to be controlling and abusive. Dee sought help with her drug use during pregnancy and went to an inpatient treatment program. While there, she saw information about a local domestic violence shelter. After a particularly violent incident with Keith about a year after the baby was born, Dee decided to call the shelter and seek help leaving Keith. Dee's now living at the shelter and seeking full legal and physical custody of her year-old son. What additional information would you want to know if you were the attorney representing her in this custody case? And while I'd usually throw that open to the audience, I think I'm going to throw it to our expert right now since we're on limited time. But I do want to just note that this case scenario is an amalgamation of so many of the cases that we see. And so this isn't something that's unusual or outlandish. This is a scenario that many survivors might be confronting in one form or another. With that, I'll hand it over to Lee.
And I think I'm going to answer it a little bit differently than the question is posed, which is just to pull out for you the things that you might want to be thinking about in this case. So what I would expect to hear from Keith in this case would be about Dee's history of depression and Dee's drug use. And what you'd want to do with that is to be able to show, look, she's in an inpatient program. She sought help during her pregnancy that Keith was using as well, that Keith has been violent, that Keith has been trafficking her. Some questions that are going to come up are around proof, right? What's the evidence that he was abusing her? Does she have medical records? Does she have police records? Does she have anything else? Can she prove that she was being trafficked? Does she have the profile on Craigslist? Does she have a screenshot? Can she show that? And then does she want to? Because if she does that, she should anticipate that Keith will suggest that she was a volitional sex worker, which, as we've said, would be used against her. Another thing that you might not have pulled out, but you want to, is Dee's unstable housing. So the fact that Dee has left and gone into shelter, some of us would see as a really good thing, right? That she was taking steps to protect herself and her child. But the instability of her housing, again, is something that could be used against her, particularly if a judge doesn't find credible the evidence of the violence or the trafficking. We want to think about what other resources are available to Dee: emotional resources, economic resources, and community support kinds of resources. We want to ask before we even file this case, is Keith going to challenge her for custody of the child? If he's not going to challenge her to have control of the child in any way, it may be that you don't want to bring a case at all, because bringing that case might just show him that this is another way to continue his abuse of her. The use of the legal system to continue the abuse of somebody who's experienced intimate partner violence is pretty common. So if we sometimes talk about kind of leaving sleeping dogs lie, that if he's not actively seeking custody, she may not want to take that step. And waiting may give her the opportunity to show that she's a little more stable, to let her get employment, to have other kinds of things. I would want Dee to be able to show that she's been the primary caregiver over the period of the baby's life, that she's taking good care of the baby. You might be able to do that through doctor's records, through daycare records, through the testimony of the people in the shelter. So in a case like this one, oftentimes we think, well, the judge will just see what a terrible person he is and that she's trying really hard. And that's just not always the case. Many times people who have used violence can be incredibly persuasive and incredibly manipulative, and they do a really good job in court, and they sometimes present very well. So unless we have some kind of external supports for Dee, both in terms of evidence and in terms of the toll that this case might take, we'd look really hard at bringing it in the first place.
Thank you so much, Lee. Jessica, do you have any final thoughts or additions to add?
I think I would just like to contrast, just another reminder, because everyone knows this is my favorite topic. I'd like to contrast Lee's description of Keith as potentially being very well performing in court and very manipulative, and the impact, again, that trauma has on the ability of an individual or the willingness of a survivor to be able to communicate what has happened to them effectively, to be able to explain things in a linear fashion, to be able to remember important details, to be able to present without a flat affect. And those are things that you're going to want to consider as well, depending on the presentation of Dee at the time of this court case.
Well, thank you so much to both of you, but particularly to Lee for joining us today and for sharing all of this incredible insight and guidance around how to support trafficking survivors that might also be survivors of intimate partner violence and grappling with the overlap and intersection of those issues. If you have any questions that were not answered during the webinar, please feel free to reach out to us. You'll be getting a post-webinar survey, and we'll also follow up with some additional information that we will send to you. Here's our contact information. You can feel free to reach out to me directly at email or phone, or the other presenters with any questions, or if you need any guidance with these issues in the future. So again, thank you so much to both of you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for arranging this.
Of course. Just a few small housekeeping things here at the end of the webinar. I just wanted to note that despite the closures and the kind of upheaval across so many systems that are happening right now, we wanted to let you all know that Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service, while our physical office space is closed, is remaining open and functioning with everyone working remotely. And we do have intake for legal services open right now via our dedicated phone lines and website. And we are continuing to accept new cases. You can see the contact information there. Please feel free to share that to individuals who might be in need of free legal services with civil legal issues. And of course, you can follow us on social media for updates and announcements. Jess and Leah, I'm not sure if you have any organizational announcements you'd like to share with regards to what's happening with the coronavirus.
Not for me.
Okay.
No, we are remote, but we're available via phone and email.
Great, thank you so much. And of course, we are still, as the cases are still coming in through our intake lines and online, we are of course still looking for volunteers. If you're interested in volunteering with Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service and seeing what pro bono cases are out there, many of which can still be worked on and moved forward despite the social distancing that we are all practicing, you can look on our pro bono portal to see what's available. And we're here to offer guidance and support as you work through these cases. I know I've been working on expungements, other things where I've been mailing things out to clients and getting things back. So there are things that can still remain active and moving forward to help people with legal needs even during this time. We are also continuing our trainings and educational opportunities. You can go to our events page to find out more. One of our upcoming trainings next week, we'll be looking at the issue of guardianship. And again, our calendar will have the most updated information around those opportunities. We also, if you are interested in learning a little bit more at this time, would encourage you to check out some of our free recorded trainings. You can see we have a lot of topics covered in the Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Services online library, including this whole intersectionality series that we've been putting on over the last year through the Human Trafficking Prevention Project. And I would encourage you to check out some of those prior trainings if you enjoyed this one today. And with that, just a final push. If you'd like to volunteer, we'd love to have you. Thank you so much for everyone's time and interest in this topic. A huge special thank you again to Lee Goodmark for being our guest presenter today. And as ever, to my colleague, Jessica Emerson, the greatest co-host I could ever wish for. And with that, we will sign off and hope to see you again sometime. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we look forward to speaking soon.